Thank you so much for the opportunity to be at the center and be able to share some of the work. I appreciate the work that the center is doing and Professor Min has been doing and his commitment to expanding knowledge and understanding of the Korean American population in particular. Let me figure this out. I think it cannot be overstated the importance of religion and religious identity for Korean Americans. Their estimated participation ranges from a low of 60% to as high as 80% in different studies that have been conducted through the different decades. The importance of religious identity and participation is well known, but perhaps lesser known are some of the nuances of how religious participation and their correlated consequences or patterns. What are some of those associated patterns of religious participation, and how do they play out in everyday life? So these were some of the questions that I wanted to ask in a large data set of a national study that I conducted on Asian Americans. So these are the particular questions that frame this particular presentation. How do Korean Americans who differ in their religious identities, that is specifically Protestants, Catholics, and the non-religious, how do these groups differ in their demographic characteristics and the expressions of their cultural identity, as well as individual and family stressors? So this is the framing question for my presentation this morning. So as just a quick methodological overview, the data comes from a national survey of Korean Americans that was conducted. This is a subset of a much larger data set. So I'm going to describe for you how we obtained the larger data set. We looked at 5 main domains. This parallels the census of data in that we wanted to really look at a wide range of topics as well as kind of greater depth in each of those. And so the 5 domains of the Korean American National Survey were demographic characteristics, economic activity and employment, culture, language, and identity, family health and social welfare, and finally religion and politics. So out of this larger data set, one more. So this was a survey study. This was the first truly national study that was conducted on Korean Americans. Prior to this, due to geographic limitations and difficulty of identifying and capturing the Korean American population, it was very difficult to do a truly national survey. But with support from the Overseas Korea Foundation, we had some amount of money to launch this truly national survey. We had actually good demographic representation from across the United States and across generations as well. And part of this was enabled by doing a bilingual survey. We were able to do that both online as well as paper and pencil survey. And it was particularly the online survey method using Qualtrics, which allows for simultaneous Korean and English to be presented together, that allowed us to be able to capture the widest range of Korean Americans across. So 70% of our respondents were gathered through the online method and 30% offline in traditional paper and pencil approach. We used Korean media. They were posting it on their websites. We went through the traditional routes of large churches in different geographic areas, through Korean schools. With the younger generation, we use national, professional school networks, organizations, and then from there, we utilize snowball sampling to get a fairly substantial, almost, the overall response rate was 38.98, which is fairly substantial given the size of our population. We're also able to offer some incentives, which I think helped with our sample size. So from this broader sample, I narrowed it down to the the sample size for this particular presentation subset is about 25. And I basically narrowed it down to only those that had relevant related to religious identity. So in our survey, 68% of the respondents indicated that they were Christian. About 2.5% indicated that they were Buddhist, and then 14% who indicated that they did not have any religious identification. Consistent with what Professor Min indicated earlier, Korean Americans, those who do practice religion, are very fervent and very devout. About 71% attend services at least once a week or more. And of those who are religiously identified, 74% indicated that they attend a predominantly Korean-identified religious institution, place of worship, and 26% said that they did not. So from this, I narrowed the sample size down to the Christian and the non-religious. And from within the Christian population, I subdivided it and combined and looked at with Protestants, and I took the three of the largest groups. The Presbyterian group, as you can see, is a very sizable part of our sample, and then the Baptist, and then the Methodist. So those three groups comprise my Protestant sample, and then the Catholic sample, and then the non-religious sample. So this is the breakdown of the participants in this particular data set for this particular presentation. So I looked at a range of demographic patterns, and what is significant, what the differences as well as the lack of differences are both, I think, interesting. In terms of where the religious identity among the Protestant, the Catholics, and those without a religious identity, there were no differences between these three groups in the area of income, level of education, and employment patterns. And almost all of the other demographic kinds of characteristics that we collected. When looking across those variables, there really were not any noticeable differences. There were, however, two areas in which we did find statistically significant difference between and among these three groups, and that was where they were born. Whether they were born in the United States or in Korea, as well as in generational status. So if we look at, in terms of place of birth, we see that this particular configuration of where they were born, fair amount, you can see with the Protestant being the largest percentage, they take up the largest portion of those who were born in Korea as well as in the United States. And the biggest discrepancy is within that Protestant population. Within the Catholic population, very little discrepancy between those who were born in the United States as well compared to those in the U.S. in Korea. And a little bit more so for the non-religious, but it's clearly the Protestant group where you see that biggest discrepancy. Next, if we look at the religious group differences by generational status, you'll see this breakdown here. In the Catholic population, you see that 39% are first generation. The discrepancy is not really noticeable within the non-religious population. And with the Protestant population, you also see a fair amount of discrepancy in proportion of those who are within the first generation, the 1.5 generation, and the second generation and above. We looked at a number of factors, acculturative stressors and other dimensions related to cultural identities. So types of acculturative stressors in terms of the adjustment process, the language that is used in the home, and how they self-identify in terms of their ethnic label. In terms of the overall just kind of information, these were some of the acculturative stressors that had the highest rating: economic difficulties, cultural differences, language communication, and so on and so forth. And you have the mean scores as well as the standard deviation. So this is for the total sample, and it just gives you a sense of which of these particular issues were of greatest concern for the sample as a whole. Also, if you look in terms of language use overall, you see that for the sample as a whole, again, that's 57% prefer to use English. And this was particularly tied to which language did they use in completing the survey. Because it was bilingual, we wanted to assess which language they were using primarily. Were they using Korean, English, or about equally English and Korean? We also asked in terms of primary language in the home. So you see that there's a bit of a discrepancy between what is their preferred language in completing the survey versus the language that is used in the home. But again, that is an aggregated information. This is another aggregate data in terms of self-identification of the sample as a whole. How much do they identify Korean only versus American only versus Korean American versus Asian American. So you see that vast majority of them identify as Korean American with very little difference between women and men. So again, drilling it down and looking at across these three different groups, we found no significant difference among these three groups in the degree of acculturation, how much they identify in terms of their Koreanness, or their patterns of social interactions with Koreans and non-Koreans. And these are fairly significant markers and domains of acculturation. So on the whole, there were not really meaningful, significant differences between these groups in these areas of acculturation. However, there was a very interesting pocket of difference, particularly with regard to language and the salience of language for themselves and for their children, and in the education of Korean language for their children. So these were the language questions where we found significant differences among the groups. How important is it for you to be able to speak Korean? There was a difference there. How important is it for your children to speak Korean? How well do your children speak Korean? And have any of your children attended Korean language schools? So in these cluster of items related to Korean language, we found highly significant differences among these three religious groups. So to give you a pattern here, we see that for the Protestants, it was most important, with the Catholics being somewhere in between, and those who are not religious indicating the least amount, attribution of importance to speaking Korean. So it's interesting how religious identity does seem to be interacting with language identity. Similar kind of pattern with some variation for how important is it for your children to speak Korean? You see this pattern. And then how well do your children actually speak Korean? Yeah. Overall pattern is very similar. And then when we asked how many of their children had actually had attended Korean language schools, you can see that the Protestants by far had the highest percent of those who sent their children to Korean language schools. All right. Moving on to family concerns, we looked at marital status and satisfaction with marriage, types of problems in the home, and types of family stressors. And here again, overall data, these are some of the items that had the highest level of concern: marital conflict, children's education, parent-child conflict, mental health, spousal abuse, and alcohol and addiction. So these are just kind of the top 6, if you will. But if we look at it in greater detail, we see that among these, there were no differences among the three religious groups in how much parent-child conflict, mental health concerns, as well as spousal abuse. So that's the good news. But there were some interesting differences across these religious identities in children's education, their concern about their children's education, and marital conflict, as well as alcoholism and addiction. So at this point, I give you a second or so to speculate as to how you think the patterns might play out, and in your understanding why those patterns may play out. So if you can kind of imagine what your anticipated hypothesis may be. So this is the actual pattern in relation to concerns about children's education. Protestants and Catholic fairly similar, but both much more concerned about their children's education-related issues than those who are not religious. However, it's a different pattern in terms of marital conflict. That when it comes to marital conflict, actually the Protestants are reporting far less concern around issues of marital conflict than those who are Catholic, followed by those who are not religious. So there's something about this particular issue that seems to be much more salient within the Catholic population. Alcoholism and addiction as well, with the Protestant population having the lowest indicator, but the Catholics having the highest, and probably a non-significant difference between those who are Catholic and non-religious. So in terms of individual stressors, there were no significant differences in money or financial matters, experience of racism, social life, friendships, and physical health or insured status. So this spans a lot of individual health and individual factors. So on most of these indicators, there were no differences between these three religious groups. However, there were, in terms of employment stressors, death or injury of a close family member or friends, as well as marital stress and intimate relationships. These were statistically significant. And again, in terms of employment stressors, Protestants reporting the least amount of stress, followed by Catholics, with the non-religious group experiencing the highest amount of stress. Death or injury of a close person, this was kind of a puzzlement for me, and I'm not sure exactly why it is. It could just be a fluke, a coincidence, but nevertheless, it is a statistically significant difference between those two groups, with the Protestants indicating the highest level of stress related to this, and the not religious group not really indicating this as a major issue for them. And finally, in terms of marital stress, Protestants indicating that they are not experiencing much, or of the three groups indicating the lowest, and then the Catholics and the non-religious similarly indicating higher level of stress related to this area. So in a quick summary, and I look forward to possibly speculating about reasons why, but some just observations, the importance of Korean language among Korean American Protestants. So I think by this we're able to kind of nuance not only religion and the salience of religion, but how that plays out particularly within the Protestant population, and why this is a kind of a more unique feature to the Korean Protestant, more so than Catholics and especially those who are not religious. There does seem to be a general pattern in which individual marital and family stressors seem to be highest for those who are non-religious, and for the most part the lowest among those who are Protestant, with Catholics being somewhat in between. But also I want to note that there are many, many ways, and much more so than not, ways in which these religious groups and identities do not differ in most of the ways. So I do highlight those areas where there are differences, but for the most part there really are far, far fewer differences and far more greater commonalities. And the questions that remains, and this is where I look forward to kind of speculating with you and considering together, is now that we have observed these patterns of differences, I think it's a much more complicated question to ask why these kinds of differences exist. And perhaps we can draw upon existing literature, but this is where, coming from a quantitative perspective, I think a complementary qualitative perspective may need to it needs to be incorporated to fully be able to unpack and understand how differences in religious identities and affiliations express themselves in these everyday ordinary ways. Thank you very much.